I hope you don't mind that I say hello to everyone because you all mean so much to me. And as it turns out, every second Tuesday in the morning, I accompany my dear Toby to a certain protocol. These are infusions that Toby is taking, and thank God doing well with. So I treasure these moments, and we're in Lech Lecha, and I'd like to do something very controversial, which is found in Torat Ahava. If some of you have the book, it's on page 43 in Bereshit. And to talk about the relationship between Abraham and Yishmael. Abraham, of course, has two primary sons. He has a son from from Sarah, who is Yitzchak, and he has a son from Hagar. Hagar gives birth to Ishmael. Of course, after the death of Sarah, he marries another woman, or some say it's Hagar again. He remarried her. Apparently, they had a separation, according to some, and he had many more children. But his two primary children are Yitzchak and Yishmael. And right at the outset, I want to say the following, that the Yishmael story is, on its most foundational level, the characters are not understood properly from a historical perspective. Excuse me, just one moment. I'm sorry. Not understood from an historical perspective, in that today the Muslim world looks at Yishmael as a patriarchal figure, and they interpret the Bible, the Quran. They see Ishmael as having, in the end, been the true covenantal successor of Abraham. And that is why, and of course, we strongly disagree, and we believe that the covenantal heir was Isaac. And to this day, when you come to the cave of Machpelah in Hebron, where the patriarchs are buried, there is disagreement concerning that second patriarch. And so we venerate the grave of Yitzchak, and the Arabs, when they come there, they venerate the grave of Ishmael. And of course, we know that before 1967, Jews were not permitted to visit Hebron. They were only permitted, some were permitted to walk up 7 of the steps that, it's a very, very high hill that leads to the cave of Machpelah, and just tangentially, from 1948 to 1967, Jews were not permitted into the city of Jerusalem. All of the synagogues were destroyed. Many of the monuments of graves were used to build latrines, or were used to cement sidewalks. You'd be walking on monuments. That's very, very clear. And of course, it's an olam hafuch. It's a mixed up world that today, as open as Jerusalem is, as open as it is, we're being declared that we're the racist, not allowing equal access to places of worship to the Arabs, to Palestinians. But here I want to emphatically say, and we may carry part of the blame, that the interpretation of Ishmael as being the father of Islam is erroneous. Islam comes on the scene in the 6th or 7th century. That's when they come on the scene. But you know how the rabbis are. The rabbis whatever they were facing, they look at certain personalities in the Torah and they started to interpret these personalities as representing something bigger. The classic example is Esau. Esav and Yaakov, Esau and Jacob were twin brothers. They probably were identical twins. And Jacob, of course, is ultimately, he has another name, Yisrael. And when we are called B'nai Yisrael, we're the children of Jacob. Esau is different. And Esau in rabbinic literature is often associated with Rome. And while in the beginning of Christianity, Rome and Christianity were at odds, ultimately there was a coming together, and Esau is viewed as being the personification of Christianity. Now, that, of course, is bogus. It's not true. When one looks at the story of Esau in the Torah, he actually is not such an evil character, and he has nothing to do with Christianity. But the rabbis who were writing this after the destruction of the Second Temple, and so they used Esau as a personality to portray what they believed were the evil doings of Christianity, attempting to somersault and upset all of Judaism. I am not sure, and I will ask my son to look into this. He's the scholar in Midrash. We know where it started, that Esau was personified as Christianity. I'm not sure where it started that Esau represented Islam, but he's not Islam. And I especially want to say this because we're going to be studying the literal text. And as we study the literal text and we're studying the story of Ishmael and Abraham, by no means am I suggesting, even though it has been said, that this story represents the relationship between Judaism and Islam, even though as we study it, you'll see that it's not complicated to see connections between the two. That is, even though Ishmael was not Islam, one could pave a trail in understanding the text wherein it could appear as if he was, even though he was not. And I especially want to underscore this because in today's world, we, the Jewish people, are considered to be the colonialist. The indigenous population was Islam, and we come in and we overlord, we take over the lands of, that was, the indigenous population was Abraham. The claim that Jesus was Palestinian, even though, of course, Jesus precedes Islam by 700 years. In fact, my Dove, I really have encouraged him to write about it. He's at the University of Illinois, and he's in from Israel now doing intensive semester of a 7-week. They love him, so they've allowed him to come in for 7 weeks, and in the middle, he can go back for a week. You know, the story Yitz Greenberg tells about the benefactor who says to his professor, whose chair he endowed, "How many hours do you week?" So the professor says, 6 hours. And the benefactor says, not bad for a day's work. Now, when I say that to Dove, he gets upset because he actually works very, very hard on his books and his writings. But Dove said to me, you know, Abba, when I talk to all the anti-Israel people on campus, and there are too many, and they say to me that we are colonialist because we came post-Islam. I say, wait a minute, I occupy the chair of studying Second Temple history. then whatever I'm doing, in the world of academics is ridiculous. What do you mean? What second temple? There was no temple. The Jews were not there. And it's a terrible, mixed up world that if there was ever a story of an indigenous population that said, wait, we're coming back to reclaim the land. Imagine the Indians coming back to reclaim the land. Imagine, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, the Aborigines, I'm not pronouncing it right, in Australia, coming back to reclaim the land. This is a story of the indigenous population saying, we want our share of the land, even though you came much later, we're ready to partition, but you've not been ready to partition. There's no one to talk to out there. I mean, to talk about two states now, I mean, all we need is for some entity to take over Yudan Shomron, and in a month, Hamas is going to be ruling, and then the rockets are going to be just a couple miles, not miles from Ashkelon, but it'll be a couple of miles from Jerusalem. So I want to take a look at the biblical text, and I want to look at chapter 17. So if we look at chapter 17, and Lech Lecha is such a quote-unquote rich parsha, it is in Lech Lecha that God commands Abraham to circumcise himself, circumcise Ishmael as well. And at that point, God, in chapter 17, Vayome Elohim el Avraham, God says to Abraham, sentence 15, Sarai ishticha, your wife Sarah. I'm changing her name from Sarai to Sarah. Let's leave that aside. Uveirachti ota, I will bless her. Vegam natati mimena lecha ben. And she, from you, after all these years of your marriage, she will have a son. So one would imagine at that point that Abraham's reaction would be joyous. God had promised me a child. My wife, my first wife, my favorite wife, if you will, is Sarah. When one looks at the text, God had never, ever up to this point promised that Sarah would mother the child. It's quite possible that even though God says Abraham will be the father of the Jewish people, maybe it would be through progeny born from a different wife, maybe from Hagar, whom the previous chapter mentioned Abraham married. But now God says Sarah's going to have a child. So if we would read this and know nothing about the Bible except for what we've read up to now, we would say, wow, if we were to be asked, what would Abraham's reaction? I would say he would be just ecstatic. I'm going to have a child with Sarah. And God says, Uveirachti ota, I will bless her. V'gam natati mimena lecha ben, she will have a son, that's sentence 16. Uveirachtia, and I will bless her. And many tribes will come from her. What's Abraham's reaction in an amazing sentence, sentence 17? Vayipol Avraham al panav vayitzchak. Abraham falls on his face and laughs, and he says, what, are you kidding me, God? Is this possible? I'm 100 years old. My wife is 90. And even though people birth then late, we've been living together for 25 years and who knows how long. How can this happen? This is not going to happen. And then Abraham speaks again, Vayom Avraham. And beyond the fact that for me to have a child with Sarah is beyond anything that's possible, Abraham says, Lu Yishmael Yichya lefanecha. I already have a son. I have a son born from Hagar. His name is Yishmael. Lu Yishmael Yichya lefanecha. Now, if we had time, if we were in front of each other, I would go around and ask What do you think Abraham meant when he said, Lu Yishmael Yechia Lefanecha? You could push it and say that when Abraham heard that Isaac would be born, maybe he thought that it would be at the expense of Ishmael's life, that Ishmael would somehow die. So he says, oh, if only Ishmael would remain alive. But when you read it in its simple sense, Abraham is saying, God, it's okay. I already have a child. No need for Yitzchak. But then in sentence 19, a very important sentence, Vayoma Elohim, and God said, Aval Sarah ishtecha yoledet lecha ben. Sarah, your wife, is going to bear a child to you, will bear you a son from your loins. V'karata et shmo Yitzchak, and you will call his name Yitzchak. Vakimoti et briti ito livrit olam. Here it is. And my covenant is going to be through him. Lizaro acharav. My covenant, the Brit, will be with Abraham. The Brit will not be through Yishmael. And as to your relationship with Yishmael, sentence 20, Ul Yishmael shematicha. Concerning Ishmael, I've heard your concerns. Hine beirachti oto. I've blessed him. Vifreti oto. And he will multiply. Vihirbeti oto bim'od ma'od. Shnei mason nisiyim yolid. He's going to have 12 descendants. But as it says in sentence 21, God repeats, the et briti akim et Yitzchak. But the covenant is with Isaac. Asher teled lecha Sarah lamoed hazeh bashana ha'acheret. If I could face everyone, let's listen to what we write in the book Torat. After God tells Abraham that Sarah will have a child, Abraham declares, if only Ishmael would live before you. Ishmael is Abraham's child from Hagar. Bearing in mind that God has just promised Abraham a son from Sarah, this is a strange response. Perhaps at that time, Abraham felt that Ishmael would be the second patriarch. And I want to add to that, maybe for good reason, because God, in chapter 15, in the Covenant of the Pieces, tells Abraham the future. He tells Abraham, you're going to be the first patriarch, and he then spells out how it will occur. You will be a stranger in your land. He's talking about Egypt. You'll be a stranger, you'll be enslaved, and then you're going to be freed, and you're going to get to Israel, your descendants. But that word that he uses is, and you'll be a stranger. What is the word for stranger? Ger. And what is the name of the second wife of Abraham? Hagar. 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 Is it possible that Abraham thought, goodness sakes, Hagar, she's a stranger. And as a matter of fact, she was a handmaid. She was a handmaid. She was the female equivalent of a slave. And some would argue that she was afflicted the way Abraham cast her out. So maybe Abraham felt this way because he saw in Hagar the beginning of the fulfillment of the covenant given to Abraham that he would have a child. And the child, the future of the child would be such that he would be a stranger. He would be enslaved. He would be afflicted. And he looks out there and he says, my goodness, this is Hagar. She's a handmaid. She's a slave. She is that, and she's been afflicted. She is the first matriarch. The real question of whether Ishmael or Isaac should be the first patriarch is a deeper question. The question was, who should be the first matriarch? Is it Sarah or is it Hagar? That is why when God says to Abraham, Sarah will have a child, I believe that here it is not only God saying that Isaac is the covenantal heir. You can love Ishmael, but Isaac is the covenantal heir, not Ishmael. But God is also proclaiming that not only you, Abraham, are part of the covenant, but Sarah is part of the covenant. The covenant is not patriarchal alone. It's a fusion of matriarch and patriarch and matriarch, matriarch and patriarch. Now let's take a look, if you will. Let's take a look at in the book, Shuli, page 43, and I'd like to read this to you. And I'm going to ask Shuli if you can at least send out just this chapter because it requires more analysis and more study, but we're touching upon some of the major points. Let's take 2 paragraphs from the bottom of page 43, and if we can point to it. Is it possible that Hagar came to believe that she would be the bearer of Abraham's covenantal seed? I'll leave this paragraph out because it mentions another supporting point. Is it possible that Abraham also believed that? Now let's look at the last paragraph of page 43. Thus, in chapter 17, when God reaffirms the covenant with Abraham, Abraham assumes it will be with Ishmael. That's why he says, oh God, I'm happy, I've got Ishmael. It is here that God tells Abraham that a child will be born to Sarah, page 44. Abraham, understandably confused, cries out, isn't Ishmael that child? It is here that God definitively declares that while Ishmael will become a great nation, and I would add, while Ishmael can be loved, the covenantal continuity will be through Isaac. If I can face everyone, that's the moment. That's the moment of the tension. Now, bearing in mind what I said at the outset, that Ishmael is not Muslim, but there is a tension here of what's happening today, where the Muslim world, certainly the Shiite world and the Jewish world are in contest. They're in conflict. Who is the rightful heir? Even as we say, we're ready to share. We've said this for years. Now we believe we have no one to share with. I think the vast majority of the vote in Israel, vast majority, is of that position. Yeah, we were willing to give, but that's not as if we don't believe that claim-wise it's all ours. But to live in peace, 2 people making this claim, even if the other claim is bogus, for the sake of peace, we want to make peace. But the other side doesn't want. And I want to add something to this. Think about Isaac and Ishmael. They're very similar. I believe they could be the only 2 people in the Bible whose name was given by God. God right here says, you'll have a child, Abraham, with Sarah, and his name will be Isaac. And God told Hagar when she was floating around the desert, you will have a child, and his name will be Ishmael. And there's another parallelism we just read, that God says to Ishmael that you're going to have 12 princes who will come from you. And this reverberates with the image of the 12 tribes. And so the conclusion we're reaching is that while Ishmael, like Isaac, is beloved by Abraham, covenantal continuity will be the exclusive domain of Isaac's, whose descendants will liberate and settle